Welcome to Stories of Slavery. Today, we travel to 1861. Her name was Celia. Day after day, plate after plate, she fed her masters until they became heavy, sluggish, grotesque with indulgence. Then this enslaved woman committed an act no one would ever forget. This story is difficult. Pause for a moment. Listen closely. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city and country you are listening from. Your voice ensures these lives are remembered, not erased. Now, let us begin. On the morning of April 12, 1861, as Confederate cannons thundered against Fort Sumter in South Carolina, something quieter yet equally revolutionary was unfolding 600 miles away in the Louisiana Bayou country. A woman, legally barred from reading or writing, was about to execute one of the most daring escapes in American slavery's long history. Her name was Celia. 31 years old. For 17 years she had cooked for a family that had stripped everything from her. Now she was about to reclaim it all. This is the story plantation owners tried to erase. This is the story of how patience, intelligence, and a cast-iron skillet allowed one woman to defeat an entire system built to destroy her. And this is the story of a single plate left on a breakfast table, a plate that would haunt a family until their final days. But to comprehend what occurred that April morning, we must go back. We must travel to a place called Magnolia Grove. To a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and suffering. To a young girl who arrived there with nothing except the recipes her mother had whispered to her on the auction block. Magnolia Grove Plantation sat 12 miles northwest of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a parish later named East Feliciana. The property sprawled across 2,400 acres of fertile bottomland along Thompson Creek, a tributary feeding into the Mississippi River. In 1844, when our story begins, 847 enslaved people lived there, producing nearly 900 bales of cotton annually, each bale weighing approximately 400 pounds. 3 generations of the Beaumont family had possessed this land, passed down from a French-Canadian fur trader who had received the original Spanish land grant in 1779. The main house was a Greek Revival mansion, 14 rooms, 6 white columns, a front porch stretching 60 feet across. Visitors from New Orleans frequently made the 3-day journey upriver simply to see it. But architecture was not their purpose. Food was. Above all else, the Beaumont family was renowned throughout Louisiana for their table. Dinner at Magnolia Grove was an event discussed for months afterward. 7 courses. English china. French crystal. Dishes so extraordinary that grown men were said to weep after tasting them. What those visitors never knew, what they never thought to ask, was who actually created those dishes. The answer worked 18 hours daily in a sweltering kitchen house 50 feet behind the main mansion. A separate brick building, designed to reduce fire risk. Inside that kitchen, where temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees during Louisiana summers, a young woman performed miracles with flour, butter, and whatever ingredients she could coax from the plantation gardens. Her name, as recorded in the Beaumont family ledger dated March 3, 1844, was simply Celia, female, approximately 14 years, cook, purchased Charleston, $6.50. That single line comprised the entirety of the official record of her arrival. It told nothing of the auction block where she had stood barefoot in South Carolina's spring mud. Nothing of the moment the auctioneer tore her from her mother's embrace. Nothing of the 3-week journey by ship and river barge that brought her to Louisiana. And certainly nothing of the words her mother had whispered in those final seconds before they were separated forever. Her mother, whose name was Dinah, had cooked on the Peshin plantation near Charleston for 22 years. She had learned from her own mother, who had learned from hers, a chain of knowledge stretching back to the rice kitchens of West Africa. Dinah understood things about food that no French-trained chef could ever comprehend. She knew how to create something from nothing. She knew how to transform the scraps slave owners deemed unworthy into dishes that nourished both body and soul. And in those precious final moments with her daughter, she had passed on the most important lesson she had ever learned. "Remember everything," Dinah whispered as the auctioneer approached. "Watch them. Learn them. They underestimate us because they think we are nothing. That is their weakness. Make yourself valuable. Make yourself necessary. And when the time comes, you will know what to do. Celia was 14 years old when she heard those words. She would carry them for the next 17 years like a stone in her pocket, smoothed by constant touching, a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she still had left to accomplish. The Beaumont family who purchased her consisted of 5 people. The patriarch was Master Henri Beaumont, age 52 in 1844, a man whose appetites were legendary even by the excessive standards of the antebellum South. Henri stood 5 feet 9 inches and weighed, according to his physician's records that survived the war, approximately 280 pounds. He suffered from gout, digestive complaints, and a heart condition his doctor repeatedly warned him about. He ignored every warning. Food was his passion, his obsession, and ultimately his destruction. His wife, Marguerite Beaumont, was 47 years old and nearly as large as her husband. In her youth she had been considered a beauty, the daughter of a wealthy sugar planter from St. James Parish. Now she rarely left the house, finding the Louisiana heat unbearable for someone of her size. She spent her days in a specially reinforced rocking chair on the back gallery, fanning herself and directing the household enslaved people in their duties. She held particular opinions about food and was never satisfied with anything. Their 3 children were all grown by 1844. The eldest, Henri Jr., was 24 and had already developed his father's physique and appetites. He managed the plantation's daily operations with a cruelty that even other slaveholders found distasteful. The middle child, Marguerite Claire, was 22 and had married a planter from Natchez. She visited often, always bringing complaints about the food at her husband's home. The youngest, Philippe, was 19 and studying law in New Orleans, returning home every few months to remind his family how sophisticated he had become. Into this household came Celia, a terrified 14-year-old who had never seen Louisiana before, who spoke the Gullah dialect of the Carolina Low Country, which the Beaumonts could barely understand, who possessed exactly one asset that would determine her entire future. She could cook. The previous cook at Magnolia Grove had died 3 weeks before Celia's arrival. An elderly woman named Hester, she had worked in that kitchen for 41 years. Her death had thrown the household into chaos. Marguerite Beaumont had attempted to supervise the cooking herself, an experiment lasting exactly 2 days before she declared it impossible. Henri Beaumont dispatched his agents to Charleston with specific instructions: find a cook, find a good one, and bring her back regardless of cost. They found Celia on the auction block on a Tuesday morning in February 1844. The Peshin family was selling off their enslaved people to pay debts, and Dinah's daughter was listed in the sale catalog as trained in cookery. The Beaumont agent, a man named Thibodeau, asked her 2 questions. Could she make gumbo? Could she make biscuits? When Celia nodded yes to both, Thibodeau bid $650, won her, and put her on a ship that same afternoon. She arrived at Magnolia Grove on March 3, 1844. The kitchen house, where she would spend most of the next 17 years, was waiting for her. The kitchen was a single large room measuring approximately 20 feet by 30 feet. One entire wall was dominated by a massive fireplace with a cooking crane that could swing iron pots over the flames. A brick bake oven was built into the side of the fireplace, its interior blackened from decades of use. A long wooden worktable ran down the center of the room, its surface scarred and stained from thousands of meals prepared upon it. Shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of crockery, iron pans, copper pots, and utensils. 2 small windows provided the only ventilation, utterly inadequate for the heat that built up when all the fires were burning. Celia walked into the kitchen on her first morning at Magnolia Grove. She looked around at the equipment she had to work with and understood that this was where she would either survive or die. There was no middle ground. Her first test came that very evening. Marguerite Beaumont sent word that guests would arrive for dinner, a judge from Baton Rouge and his wife. Celia had 4 hours to prepare a meal worthy of the Beaumont reputation. She had never cooked in this kitchen before. She did not know where anything was stored. She did not know the peculiarities of the fireplace, which spots burned hot and which burned cool. She did not know what ingredients were available in the smokehouse, the dairy, or the garden. And she did not know what the Beaumont family considered acceptable. What she did know was everything her mother had taught her. She knew that fear was useless and had to be pushed aside. She knew that her hands remembered things her mind might forget. And she knew that the most important ingredient in any dish was not butter or salt or spice, but attention. Complete, unwavering attention to every detail. That evening, Celia served roasted chicken with a sauce made from pan drippings, butter, and herbs she had found growing wild behind the kitchen. She served rice cooked in the Carolina style, each grain separate and perfect. She served biscuits that rose so high and light that Marguerite Beaumont later said they looked like clouds that had wandered into the breadbasket by mistake. And she served a simple cake made with molasses and pecans that the judge's wife requested the recipe for 3 times before the evening ended. She was 14 years old. She was terrified. And she had just saved her own life. Word spread quickly through the household and then through the parish. The Beaumonts had found a cook. Not just any cook, someone special. Someone whose food was different from anything anyone had tasted before. Invitations to dinner at Magnolia Grove, always coveted, became almost impossible to obtain. Henri Beaumont found himself popular in a way he had never experienced. People wanted to know him, to befriend him, to secure a place at his table. For Celia, this success meant survival, but it also meant something else entirely. Invisibility. She became so associated with the kitchen that the Beaumont family stopped seeing her as a person at all. She was simply the cook. A function rather than a human being. She served meals and disappeared. She worked 18-hour days and slept on a pallet in the corner of the kitchen house. She had no days off, no holidays, no rest. She existed only to produce food. And that invisibility, that erasure of her humanity, would become the very thing that allowed her to plan their downfall. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and meals. Spring brought fresh vegetables from the garden, tender lettuces, young onions, the first asparagus. Summer meant the crushing heat of the kitchen during canning season, when Celia would preserve hundreds of jars of fruits and vegetables for the winter months ahead. Fall was butchering time, when hogs were slaughtered and she would work for days processing meat into hams, bacon, and sausages. Winter offered a brief respite from the worst of the heat, though the kitchen fires still blazed from before dawn until long after dark. Through it all, Celia watched. She watched the family as she served them. She watched their habits, their weaknesses, their petty cruelties and small vanities. She watched the way Henri Beaumont counted money in his study, his fingers moving across the bills with the same loving attention she gave to her biscuit dough. She watched where he kept the key to his safe, how he opened it, what combination he used. She watched Marguerite Beaumont's addiction to laudanum, the way she became drowsy and confused each evening after her medicine. She watched Henri Jr.'s gambling debts pile up, his increasingly desperate attempts to hide his losses from his father. She watched everything. And she remembered everything, exactly as her mother had told her to do. By 1850, Celia had been at Magnolia Grove for 6 years. She was 20 years old, and she had become the most valuable enslaved person on the entire plantation. Her value, as recorded in the Beaumont insurance documents from that year, was listed at $2,000, more than 3 times what they had paid for her. The same document noted that she was, of excellent health and temperament, skilled in all forms of cookery, and essential to the household operation. Essential. That word would come to mean everything. In the summer of 1853, something happened that would change the course of Celia's life forever. She gave birth to a son. The father was a man named Thomas, who worked as a blacksmith on a neighboring plantation. They had met when Thomas was hired to repair equipment at Magnolia Grove, and over 3 years they had fallen in love in the only way enslaved people could, in stolen moments, whispered conversations, and the constant fear that any day one of them might be sold away forever. When Celia discovered she was pregnant, she told no one. She continued working in the kitchen until the very last moment, hiding her condition beneath the loose dresses that all cooking women wore. The Beaumont family never noticed. They never looked at her closely enough to notice anything. She gave birth in the kitchen house on a sweltering August night, attended only by an elderly woman named Aunt Josephine, who had delivered most of the enslaved children on the plantation for the past 30 years. The baby was a boy, healthy and strong, with his father's broad forehead and his mother's watchful eyes. Celia named him Samuel, after a man in the Bible who had been dedicated to God's service before he was born. She did not know if God was watching over the enslaved. But she knew that she would dedicate her life to her son's survival, whatever it took, whatever she had to do. The Beaumont family learned of Samuel's existence a week after his birth. Marguerite Beaumont's only comment, recorded in her diary, was, "The cook has had a child. I hope this will not affect her work." It did not. Celia was back at the stove 3 days after giving birth, Samuel sleeping in a basket near the fire where she could watch him while she worked. For the next 8 years, Celia raised her son in that kitchen. He learned to walk on the worn wooden floors. He learned to talk while sitting on a stool watching his mother cook. He learned to read and write in secret, taught by Celia during the brief hours when the family was asleep, using a spelling book smuggled to her by a free black man who delivered goods to the plantation. Teaching Samuel to read was the most dangerous thing Celia had ever done. Louisiana law, specifically Act 26 of 1830, made it a crime to teach any enslaved person to read or write, punishable by imprisonment for up to 12 months. If discovered, both Celia and whoever had given her the book could face severe punishment. But Celia had decided something during those long nights nursing her infant son. She had decided that Samuel would not grow up in ignorance. He would have knowledge. He would have skills. And when the opportunity came, he would have a chance at freedom. By 1861, Samuel was 8 years old. He was smart, quick, and curious about everything. He could read at a level that would have impressed most white children his age. He could do arithmetic, could write in a clear hand, and had memorized long passages from the Bible that Celia had taught him. He was also old enough to understand what he was, what his status in this world was, and what it meant for his future. The Beaumont family had noticed Samuel by now. More specifically, Henri Jr. had noticed him. Henri Jr., now 41 years old and running the plantation with an increasingly desperate hand as his gambling debts mounted, had begun looking at Samuel with an expression that made Celia's blood run cold. He was calculating the boy's value. In January of 1861, Celia's worst fears were confirmed. She was serving dinner when she overheard Henri Jr. speaking to his father about finances. The conversation was conducted in French, which the Beaumonts assumed their enslaved people did not understand. They were wrong. Celia had taught herself French over 17 years of listening to family conversations, and she understood every word. "The Hutchinson debt must be paid by April," Henri Jr. said. $4,300. "We don't have it." "Then we sell," Henri Sr. replied, his mouth full of roasted pork. "We sell some of the field hands. I've already spoken to the traders. The market is depressed. We'd get nothing for them." "Then what do you suggest?" Henri Jr. paused. Celia felt his eyes move toward the kitchen door, where Samuel often sat in the evenings, waiting for his mother. "The cook's boy," he said. "I've had inquiries. Bright child, strong. The Hutchinson plantation in Mississippi is looking for young stock. They'd pay well for him." The Hutchinson plantation. Celia knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Located in the Mississippi Delta near a place called Sunflower County, the mortality rate for enslaved people there was catastrophic. The work was brutal, the conditions inhuman. They called it the Inferno. Sending a child there was essentially a death sentence. "He's worth more here," Henri Sr. said dismissively. "His mother cooks better when he's around. She'd be useless if we sold him. She'd adjust. They always do." Celia stood frozen in the doorway, the serving dish in her hands growing cold. She heard Henri Sr. grunt, which meant he was considering it. She heard Henri Jr. press his case, talking about the debts, the interest, the urgency. And she heard finally the words that would set everything in motion. "Fine," Henri Sr. said. "But not until April. Let her prepare the spring entertaining season first. After Easter, you can do what you want with the boy." April. Celia had until April. 3 months to do the impossible. 3 months to plan an escape. 3 months to save her son's life. That night, after the family had gone to bed, Celia sat in the kitchen house with her sleeping son and made a decision. She would not run blindly into the swamps, hoping for the best. She would not trust to luck or God or the kindness of strangers. She would plan. She would prepare. And she would use every single thing she had learned in 17 years of watching this family to destroy them. The first thing she needed was information. She needed to know the routes north, the safe houses, the people who could be trusted. She needed to understand the geography between Louisiana and freedom, the rivers to cross, the towns to avoid, the distances involved. The second thing she needed was money. Escaping was not free. There were bribes to pay, transportation to arrange, food and supplies to acquire. Without money, even the most carefully planned escape would fail. The third thing she needed was time. Time to prepare without arousing suspicion. Time to put everything in place. Time to wait for the perfect moment. And she had exactly 3 months to acquire all three. The next morning, Celia began to cook. She cooked with more skill and more attention than she ever had before. She prepared meals that made Henri Beaumont moan with pleasure. She created desserts that Marguerite Beaumont declared were the finest she had ever tasted. She established herself in those critical weeks as absolutely indispensable. But in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the family slept off their massive meals, Celia was doing something else entirely. She was building a network. It started with a man named Ezekiel, who drove the supply wagon that came to Magnolia Grove every 2 weeks from Baton Rouge. Ezekiel was a free black man, one of approximately 18,000 free people of color living in Louisiana before the war. He had documents proving his status, which allowed him to travel freely throughout the region. And he had connections to something that most white Southerners refused to believe existed, the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad in Louisiana was different from its northern branches. There was no clear path to Canada from the Deep South. Instead, the Louisiana network focused on getting people to Mexico, where slavery had been abolished in 1829, or to the free black communities in New Orleans, where escaped slaves could sometimes blend in with the free population. The roads were dangerous, the distances enormous, and the chances of success frighteningly small. But they existed. And Ezekiel knew them all. Celia approached him carefully over several weeks. A comment here, a question there. A small gift of food that let him know she could be trusted. Finally, in late January, she told him what she needed. "I need to get north," she whispered while loading supplies from his wagon. "Me and my son." Before April. Ezekiel did not react visibly. He had heard requests like this before. "North is hard," he said quietly. "Mexico is easier. I need to get to free territory. Real free territory. Somewhere they can't come after us. That's Canada. That's 1,800 miles from here. Through enemy territory every step of the way." "I know." Ezekiel was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I'll see what I can do." Over the next 6 weeks, Ezekiel became Celia's lifeline to the outside world. He brought her maps drawn on scraps of cloth that could be hidden in her clothing. He brought her names of people along the route who could provide shelter. He brought her information about river crossings, about the timing of slave patrols, about the 1,000 small details that would mean the difference between freedom and death. And he brought her something else. Hope. The route he described would take them up the Mississippi to Memphis, then overland through Tennessee to Kentucky, then across the Ohio River into Indiana. From there, they would make their way to Detroit and cross into Canada. The journey was approximately 1,500 miles, on foot, traveling at night, hiding during the day. It would take at least 2 months. 2 months of running. 2 months of terror. 2 months of hoping that every sound in the darkness was not a slave catcher's dog. But at the end of those 2 months, freedom. Real freedom. A life where Samuel could grow up as a human being rather than property. A life where Celia could cook for herself, for her son, for people who would pay her wages and treat her with respect. It was worth any risk. It was worth everything. But there was still the matter of money. Celia knew exactly where the Beaumont family kept their wealth. She had been watching for 17 years, after all. Henri Beaumont kept a safe in his study, a heavy iron box manufactured by the Diebold Company of Cincinnati. It was built into the wall behind a portrait of his father. The combination was 3 numbers that he changed every few months, but which Celia had memorized each time by watching his fingers as she served him coffee during his evening accounting sessions. The current combination, as of February 1861, was 23 right, 7 left, 31 right. Inside that safe, according to what Celia had observed over the years, was approximately $3,000 in paper currency, another $1,500 in gold coins, and Marguerite Beaumont's jewelry collection, valued at perhaps $5,000 or more. There were also documents, the plantation's financial records, notes on various debts and loans, and the ownership papers for every enslaved person on the property. Those ownership papers were what Celia wanted most of all. In the antebellum South, an enslaved person caught without proper documentation was subject to immediate arrest and sale. But an enslaved person with forged freedom papers could sometimes pass as a free person of color, at least long enough to reach safety. If Celia could destroy the Beaumont's records of ownership and create believable forgeries showing that she and Samuel had been legally freed, their chances of successful escape would increase dramatically. It was an audacious plan. It was also incredibly dangerous. If she was caught opening that safe, the punishment would be severe. At minimum, she would be whipped. More likely, she would be sold south, to the very plantation where they were planning to send Samuel. At worst, she could be killed outright. But Celia had stopped weighing risks the moment she heard Henri Jr. casually discuss selling her child to his death. There were no longer any risks too great to take. In early March, Celia put the second phase of her plan into motion. She began to cook even more elaborately than before, creating meals so rich and so plentiful that the Beaumont family was stuffed to discomfort every single night. She made gravies thick with butter. She made desserts heavy with cream and sugar. She made portions that would have fed twice the number of people at the table. And the Beaumonts ate. They always ate. They could not help themselves. By the end of March, Henri Beaumont had gained nearly 15 pounds. His wife was so heavy that she required assistance to rise from her chair. Henri Jr. had developed a persistent indigestion that kept him awake at night. The entire family was lethargic, bloated, and increasingly immobile. This was not accidental. This was strategy. Celia knew that her escape would require every possible advantage. A family too stuffed to move quickly would be slow to respond when they discovered what had happened. A family sedated by their own gluttony would sleep more deeply, giving her more time to act. A family accustomed to excess would not notice the subtle changes she was making in their household until it was far too late. Meanwhile, she was making other preparations. She was setting aside small amounts of food that would travel well, dried meat, hard biscuits, cheese preserved in wax. She was gathering warm clothing for herself and Samuel, hiding it in a bundle beneath the kitchen floorboards. She was memorizing every detail of the route north, going over it in her mind each night until she could recite it in her sleep. And she was recruiting allies. Magnolia Grove, like most large plantations, was home to a community of enslaved people who had developed their own networks of communication and mutual support. News traveled through the quarters with astonishing speed, passed from person to person in whispers, in coded songs, in the turn of a phrase that meant nothing to white ears but everything to those who knew how to listen. Celia let it be known, carefully, quietly, that something was going to happen. She did not say what. She did not say when. But she made sure that the other enslaved people on the plantation understood that an opportunity might present itself, and that those who were ready to take it should prepare. By April 1st, 37 people had indicated their willingness to run. They ranged in age from a grandmother of 60 who refused to die in bondage to a young man of 19 who had been threatened with sale the previous month. They included field hands and house servants, skilled craftsmen, and common laborers. They came from different backgrounds, different jobs, different quarters of the plantation. But they all shared one thing: they were ready to risk everything for freedom. Celia did not know if all 37 would actually go when the moment came. She understood that some might lose their nerve, that others might be unable to get away from their duties, that circumstances might prevent the best-laid plans from succeeding. But she also understood that there was power in numbers. The more people who escaped at once, the harder it would be for the Beaumonts to pursue any single individual. The confusion alone would buy precious time. April 12, 1861. The date had been chosen carefully. Celia had learned from Ezekiel that the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter was expected any day. The entire South was holding its breath, waiting for the war that everyone knew was coming. When it finally began, there would be chaos. Telegraph lines would be overwhelmed with military communications. Newspapers would focus on nothing but the war. Slave patrols would be distracted, their attention drawn to matters they considered more important than runaway property. It was the perfect moment to disappear. On the morning of April 12, Celia woke before dawn, as she always did. She built up the fire in the kitchen hearth, as she always did. She began preparing breakfast, as she always did. Nothing in her behavior suggested that this day would be any different from the thousands of days that had come before. But everything was different. Everything was about to change. The dinner she prepared that evening would be the most important meal of her life. It would be her masterpiece, her final gift to the family that had stolen 17 years of her existence. It would be the meal that would set her free. She began cooking at noon. She had 12 hours until the time she had chosen to act, and she intended to use every minute of them. The menu she had planned was extensive. There would be roasted pork, a whole pig that had been turning on a spit since morning. There would be fried chicken, dozens of pieces prepared in the cast-iron skillets she had seasoned over years of use. There would be oyster stew, made with shellfish brought up from the Gulf. There would be biscuits, her famous biscuits, fluffy and golden and irresistible. There would be vegetables swimming in butter. There would be cornbread soaked in pot liquor. There would be 3 different kinds of pie and a towering layer cake that she had started the day before. And there would be whiskey, bottles and bottles of Henri Beaumont's finest bourbon, which Celia had been secretly setting aside for weeks. By 6 o'clock, the dining room table was groaning under the weight of more food than even the Beaumont family could consume in a week. The family gathered, their eyes wide with anticipation. Henri Jr. had invited 2 local planters to join them, men who had heard of the Beaumont table and were eager to experience it for themselves. Celia served them. She moved around the table silently, refilling plates, pouring drinks, the perfect picture of servitude. No one looked at her face. No one noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down each dish. No one saw the fierce determination in her eyes. They ate for 3 hours. They ate until they could barely move. They ate until Henri Beaumont had to loosen his belt and lean back in his chair, groaning with satisfaction. They ate until Marguerite Beaumont declared that she could not possibly take another bite, and then ate 3 more pieces of cake. They ate until the 2 visitors had fallen asleep at the table, their heads nodding forward over plates still half full of food. By 10 o'clock, the dinner was over. The guests had been poured into their carriages and sent home. The family had retired to their bedrooms, too full to do anything but sleep. The house had fallen into the deep silence of exhausted slumber. Celia stood in the kitchen, looking out the window at the main house. Every light had been extinguished. Every door had been closed. Every member of the Beaumont family was unconscious, sleeping off the biggest meal of their lives. It was time. She moved quietly through the darkness, her bare feet making no sound on the worn paths between the outbuildings. She had walked these paths thousands of times, carrying food to the main house, returning dirty dishes to the kitchen, moving through the invisible choreography of servitude. Tonight, she walked them for the last time. She found Samuel where she had told him to wait, in the small shed behind the kitchen where the firewood was stored. He was awake, alert, his eyes shining in the darkness. He knew what was happening. They had talked about it in whispers over the past weeks, going over the plan again and again until he could recite every step. "It's time," Celia whispered. "Are you ready?" Samuel nodded. He was 8 years old. He was about to walk away from the only home he had ever known. And he was not afraid. Or if he was afraid, he did not show it. Celia took his hand, and together they moved through the darkness toward the main house. But they did not go to the kitchen door, the servants' entrance that Celia had used every day for 17 years. Instead, they went to the front of the house, to the columned porch, to the door that enslaved people were forbidden to use under any circumstances. Tonight, Celia was through following their rules. The front door was unlocked. The Beaumonts never bothered to lock it. Who would dare to enter uninvited? Who would have the audacity to walk into a white man's house without permission? Celia would. Celia did. She crossed the threshold into the grand foyer, her son's hand tight in hers. She paused for a moment, listening for any sound that might indicate someone was awake. There was nothing but the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of Henri Beaumont snoring from upstairs. The study was down the hall to the left. Celia had been in it hundreds of times, serving coffee and meals while Henri Beaumont worked at his desk. She knew every piece of furniture, every book on the shelves, every shadow in the corners. She knew where the safe was hidden. Moving silently, she crossed the foyer and entered the study. Moonlight streamed through the windows, providing just enough illumination to see. She went straight to the portrait of Henri Beaumont's father that hung on the wall behind the desk. She lifted it carefully off its hooks and set it on the floor. The safe was exactly where she knew it would be, built into the wall, its iron door cold to the touch. Celia placed her fingers on the dial and began to turn it. 23 right. 7 left. 31 right. The lock clicked open. Celia pulled the heavy door toward her and looked inside. Everything was exactly as she had expected: stacks of paper currency, a cloth bag of gold coins, a wooden box containing Marguerite's jewelry, and a leather folder containing documents, including the ownership papers for every enslaved person on Magnolia Grove plantation. She took it all. The money went into a canvas bag she had brought for that purpose. The jewelry followed. The ownership papers she tucked inside her dress against her skin, where she would feel them with every step she took toward freedom. The safe was empty. 17 years of the Beaumont family's accumulated wealth, gone in less than 5 minutes. But Celia was not finished. She had one more thing to do before she left this house forever. She went to the kitchen and retrieved a single plate from the shelf, one of the fine china plates that the Beaumonts used for their elaborate dinners. She carried it to the dining room, where the remains of that evening's feast still covered the table. She set the plate down at the head of the table, where Henri Beaumont always sat. The plate was empty. Completely, deliberately, unmistakably empty. Beside it, she placed a folded piece of paper. On that paper, in the careful handwriting she had taught herself over years of secret practice, she had written 7 words. "You ate our pain. Now feel hunger." Then she turned and walked out of Magnolia Grove forever. Outside, the night was waiting for her. Outside, 37 people were gathering in the darkness, ready to follow her toward freedom. Outside, the first shots of the Civil War had been fired that very morning, and a world was beginning to change. Celia took her son's hand and began to walk north. The story was just beginning.